The biggest updates for Humankind in a long time just dropped. Let's take a look in this video not just at the new DLC that particularly appeals to me, but also the changes coming to the broader Humankind game around trade, navy, battles, late game units, and so much more. My name is JumboPixel. Let's begin. 6 new cultures of Oceania are coming into the game, starting with Pama-Nyungan in the ancient era. As you move through to the classical era, you'll find the Polynesians. Fantastic news. Moving through to the medieval era, it's Rapa Nui. Then in Humankind's 4th era of the game, we have Māori in the early modern era. Moving through to the industrial era, we see the Hawaiians. And last but definitely not least, in the contemporary era, it's none other than the New Zealanders. Moving through from that, there is of course also another couple of things included, including 6 new wonders ranging from a Kia observatory to Whakaari White Island volcano, as well as 15 new narrative events and I believe around 7 independent peoples. And of course, we'd expect those independent peoples to broadly relate with the theme. The whole DLC is all about Oceania, or Australasia, if you like blasphemy. Another important thing to note is that a free culture is also joining the game on the 11th of September, the Caribbean Pirates. This was part of a community challenge. They were unlocked during Humankind's 2-year anniversary, and here you can see some gameplay footage. They are of course unlocked in the early modern era, alongside Dutch and Maasai. Their sparkling plunder trait gives you food, industry, money and science on all cities per army poaching resources. Talk about that a bit later in the video. You'll also get combat strength on outlaws and some health regeneration if you're poaching. And interestingly, here we have 2 unique units. The Buccaneers, a spotter gunner, 43 damage, not too shabby, and then the Sloop, an escort ship, and we'll talk a bit more about the changes to ships and everything else that goes along with the Navy very soon. But firstly, Humankind also launched on console, kind of out of the blue and around 2 years after the game initially released on Steam. I haven't played the console version myself. If you're interested in it, let me know. I can check it out, review it, see how it compares. I'm more than happy to do that, but I somehow don't quite think that will appeal to everyone. Nonetheless, they showed it off in a trailer and talked about some of the design changes and implications for a console version. And that rounds up the sort of immediate news. Now let's jump in and take a look at the latest update. And of course, there'll be footage of it on your screen. Firstly, let's talk about resources and a change to how resources and more broadly trade work. As you can see on your screen, getting access to a resource is no longer enough. You also need to have a certain amount of it, and the resource deposits on the map, luxury, strategic and otherwise, now have a quantity associated with them. If you can't get the 18 iron and 6 gunpowder for a man of war here, for example, or the lesser cost of 6 iron and 2 gunpowder for the sloop, then it'll take you a little bit longer to produce that unit. You won't be able to produce it at all, of course, if you don't have any access to iron, and if you have less than the amount, as I say, there'll be a penalty applied to its production cost. The trade menu itself has finally seen a glow up, and in my experience, it's now much easier to interact with. You can buy multiple copies of the same resource, for example, right from the get-go, and as you can see, everything's laid out pretty clearly. You can see how much it costs, how many they have. That hasn't necessarily changed between versions, but of course what has changed is all of this extra information. You can see the number of resources, how much it will cost to get access to trade them, and crucially now also a maintenance cost in upholding those trade routes, because trade routes are now a very real thing, a plunderable thing, a visual thing on the map, and of course we'll take a look at that in just a moment. But the final point that I wanted to kind of ram home here about this newly reworked trade is, honestly, it's way better. It is way better. Now in this beta version, it's not without its flaws. You'll see some tooltips kind of popping up in the way a little bit. And also, of course, this new maintenance cost is something to be considered. I noticed as I was enacting trades, I was getting more money so I could enact more trades, while also driving down my amount of money per turn, now in the negative, for example. Also a new trade interface down the bottom left, and this one's pretty important for displaying not just international trade routes, but also to get a feel for your domestic trade routes, another new addition added into Humankind. You can see you can filter between the different types of route, and it's important that you know where these lie for many reasons, including the fact that you now have to protect them from piracy and plunder. You can also use this interface, as I'm doing here, to pick up extra trade routes, see all of the goods that are being moved around, and address any blockages that might have occurred hindering your overall trade. It works into the broader system around resources now being transported between cities effectively. And of course, those actions that I was talking about earlier, brand new as well. This one here at least, poach resources. If you can find your way onto a trade route, you'll begin to poach and plunder the goods that are moving along that route. Particularly useful, of course, for international trade, obviously, and this goes alongside the already existing plunder mechanic. They work, in practice, essentially the same. Now let's talk a little bit about ships, because ships have all new typings, all new categories, and from the early modern era onwards, at least, there will now be new types, new ship classes, capital ships, escort ships, or torpedo vessels. And each one of these kind of leans into its feel, right? An escort ship you would expect to be faster, more nimble, but generally have weaker weapons. The torpedo vessels are largely the likes of U-boats and other submarines, and then of course you have your big capital ships designed to destroy. By the way, a quick shout out here to the Caribbean Pirates outfit, which just looks fantastic. With those guns and that man bag on the front. Strikingly clean white man bag, I would add, but apart from that, really does look fantastic. And as I enter a naval battle, or at least try to, clearly the enemy's not quite as interested in fighting and trying out these new techniques as I am, it brings me to, I guess, addressing naval battles more broadly. Firstly, the battlefield is much larger. This hasn't translated through to land battles, by the way, but you will notice right from the deploy phase when you're getting into a naval fight, that the deployment area is much, much larger. They've also changed the goals a little bit, so there won't be a random cache that you have to capture in some odd location. Instead, the battle will be a little bit more technical, not just in the fact that the battlefield itself is now enlarged, but also, like I mentioned, now no longer feature a flag for the defender. Beyond that though, and above that, naval units now also have retaliation. Naval units can fire against other units that are attacking them, and you'll see that play out in this grand naval battle as I now sweep across to take out their secondary fleet. Another important mechanic that's changed a little bit, although it may not necessarily be useful for me in this fight, is retreats. Starting in the second round of a naval battle, the loser, or the losing side I should say, can declare a retreat and withdraw their units to the edge of the battlefield. If they do that, it will allow them to escape next turn. So not only do we have larger battlefields with that slightly unusual defender's flag removed, we have our new ship types, and I'll talk about them a little bit more because there's actually even a bit more nuance to them than just the capital ships and the escorts. But also now there's a way to retreat. And of course, all of the tactics that come from trying to stop your opponent from doing that. Now, outside of all these specific changes, there are also some sort of more broad brush, broad stroke, generally buffs. So firstly, just a quick note that alongside those categories we talked about before, there are also 3 generic ship types: destroyers, frigates, and diesel submarines. More importantly though, they've rebalanced ships, air units, and missiles to take into account everything that encapsulates a naval battle, particularly as you move through into the later game. Firstly, on the rebalanced ships, most ships in the mid to late game will now be faster or stronger, but they'll also be comparatively more expensive. The design idea here is that ships really should wrest control of the seas. You shouldn't have standard units, rolling around beating the boats, which could happen in the previous version. In this version, seems very unlikely to. And on the air missiles, or air units and missiles, to keep pace with the increased bombardment and anti-air power that naval units bring, air units and missiles have also been buffed. So all of this late game technology, which is, let's be real, some of the more exciting units inside of Humankind that you may or may not always even get to utilize depending on your science, but irrespective of that, all of it has been buffed, lifted up. And I think that Humankind's combat, again, the mid to late game especially, really needed that. I'm a big fan of boat games, and it seems like my boat game has really upped itself in this Humankind game patch. Now let's talk some specifics. Firstly, if you'd like to play the Bonnie update now, you can play it in beta. It's available as the update preview beta build in the Steam Betas tab. I'm playing it here. It seems to work really smoothly, and by and large, there aren't too many issues aside from maybe some text in the wrong place. Now, back to the thing we talked about at the start of the video, the DLC. The DLC is set to launch next month, or I should say actually later this month. Now, the 11th of September is when that's set to go live, and of course you'll be able to purchase that on Steam or wherever else you get Humankind, because Humankind is now officially on console as well. Thank you so much for joining me, Humankind fans. If you wouldn't mind showing me some love down below, leave a like or what have you on the way out, I'd very much appreciate it, and I'll see you all next time.